I will be ranking the performance of every major PC game released in 2024 into a tier list. The most optimized games will reach tier S, while the poorly optimized ones will reach tier F. I've personally played most of the games on this list, and their rankings will reflect my first-hand experience with their PC performance. For the ones I haven't played, I will rely on performance benchmarks and insights from the gaming community for mid-range systems. A game's optimization score depends on several key factors. Reasonable hardware requirements relative to its graphics and performance. Graphics that justify the game's performance, including art style. Efficient hardware utilization, ensuring no part is left underutilized. Stable frame rates and frame times with no severe FPS drops, stuttering, or noticeable performance disparities in different areas of the game. General stability, including crashes and bugs. A robust selection of meaningful graphics settings and options that have good scalability in both performance and image quality. And finally, any updates that enhance performance after launch will be influenced in the final score. These elements are crucial for determining how well optimized a game is. With that said, let's begin, starting in order of release date. The first game on the list is Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth, a game that has a small scale and an old-gen look to it, but with some refinements to make it hold up to current-gen standards. It was a relatively easy game to run. It had reasonably low VRAM usage and a few basic settings to change. It had no stuttering issues, and it was a well-optimized game overall. But the only major issue it suffered from, alongside every game in the series so far, is the ridiculously obvious pop-in, which was noticeable even at max settings. This is unacceptable from a major game release in 2024. I will put it in tier A, a good start so far. Next is Tekken 8. While it ran at a locked 60 FPS on my PC, I did remember encountering some stutters, most likely related to loading shaders, which were especially noticeable in the campaign mode. As for lower-end GPUs, it doesn't manage to hold a steady 60 FPS, like the minimum specs suggest. It has a higher than expected entry for GPUs, that's for sure. And honestly, while it is an improvement over Tekken 7, by itself it doesn't really look that great. There's nothing that catches the eye in its visuals. It just looks like an average modern game. I will put it in tier C. Next is Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League. I honestly forgot about this game, like I'm sure most of you did. And for the 50 players who are still playing this game, good for you. As for the game itself, it's bad. The game's world looks bland, the environmental detail is very low and is mostly empty, and it's way too demanding for how it looks. The only good thing I can say about its visuals is the character rendering. Other than that, it's mostly negative. As for performance, it's very unstable, with lots of stuttering issues and uneven frame times even with the best hardware. And there is a significant CPU performance demand that bottlenecks most systems, especially if ray tracing is turned on. This is an unoptimized mess of a game and should be avoided at all costs. It will rightly go into tier F. And look at that, just 3 games in and we got our first tier F game. Next is HELLDIVERS 2, kind of a mixed bag graphically speaking. It leveraged the use of volumetrics heavily to a good implementation and offered some nice physics and deformation, but the lighting and reflections, among other aspects of the game, can sometimes look flat and can have issues. This leads to some areas looking outright gorgeous, atmospheric and immersive, like during firefights, and others looking dull and empty, like something is missing, which was mostly indoors. It also doesn't include any vendor-specific temporal-based upscalers, resulting in an aliased look with major image stability issues and a soft image overall. It could have benefited greatly from a few extra graphical options like ray-traced reflections and ray-traced ambient occlusion. As for CPU performance, it was just as expected, maintaining a mostly locked 60 FPS on lower to mid-range CPUs, and GPU performance was acceptable and performed just as expected. I will put it in tier B. Next is Skull and Bones, another game I forgot existed, let alone released this year. This disappointment of a game is a complete mess in all regards. Graphically, it looks like a PS4 game that looks like a PS3 game, and it somehow still looks worse than Assassin's Creed Black Flag in many aspects. A game that released 11 years earlier from the same company. It suffers from noticeable pop-in issues, and its art style is generic in the most negative way, making it look like one of those fake games that shows up for a few seconds in movies. Definitely doesn't look or feel like a quadruple A game, Ubisoft. As for performance, it ran just a bit lower than expected for a game of its scope, but it was acceptable if you disregard the fact that it looked like crap and consider the technicalities under the hood. And it does suffer from some performance disparities depending on the area. I will put it in tier D. Next is Alone in the Dark, an average looking game by today's standards. It ran at high frame rates and had really low system requirements, so it was very easy to run. It also had a respectable amount of settings for a small-ish game, but it suffered from major traversal stutter, which ultimately made me put it in tier E, because what good are high frame rates if the game keeps stuttering? Next is Horizon Forbidden West, a much more optimized game than the original, but that doesn't mean it's easy to run. It's actually very demanding, especially on the GPU. As for the CPU, most lower to mid-range CPUs can get a mostly stable 60 FPS on average, and the 1% low dips aren't really noticeable since this game's frame times are silky smooth, with no stuttering issues. This is a truly current-gen game that both looks good and runs just as expected from its visuals, but it could still have used some improvements, as it requires a higher baseline GPU for entry for the minimum settings, which look like crap to be honest, and that's for a stable 1080p 30 FPS, as most graphical effects are turned off entirely. I'm considering putting it in either tier B or A. I will go with tier B. Next is Dragon's Dogma 2, a game that competes with PS3 era graphics and runs like absolute dog shit. No offense to dogs, or shit. It suffered from abysmal CPU performance and stuttering issues even on the fastest CPUs. It was a broken game at launch, and tweaking the generous amount of settings didn't really help either, since the performance was still CPU bottlenecked most of the time. Lowering settings didn't improve frame rates. Future updates increased frame rates a little bit, but it was still not enough. What's even worse is even after the updates, the stuttering issues and frame drops remained, causing horrendous 1% lows. Even with the updates, this game will be put in its place, tier F. Next is Manor Lords. I know it's not a major game and it's still in early access, but it still holds the record for the most wishlisted game on Steam ever, and its graphics are really impressive for a city builder, so I figured it was worth putting on the list. And to top it off, it was mainly created by a solo developer. I covered this game at launch, and while some things may have or will change, it still holds true. For example, the game originally launched using Unreal Engine 4, and it will soon get updated to using Unreal Engine 5, with some graphical improvements of course. But from my experience, the game is generally well optimized, although a bit heavy on the GPU, and weirdly, a bit light on the CPU for a city management game, although that is very welcome. Some workload balance might be needed, but what do I know? And as such, the game runs smoothly and the 1% lows were very close to the average FPS. In its current state, I will put it in tier A. Next is Ghost of Tsushima, a technically older title designed for the original PS4 console, but with a great and timeless art style. CPU performance was mostly great, and lower to mid-range CPUs were able to achieve 60 FPS easily. But I discovered a major issue. There was uneven thread utilization that left some CPU performance on the table, leading to the 1% lows being on the lower side, and that's across the whole game, no matter if in towns or out in the open, which sometimes introduced micro-stuttering, at least on my end. As for GPU performance, it felt a bit more GPU demanding than it looks, but it was decently scalable. Other than that, the game ran really well. Finally, for the score, considering all the issues I mentioned so far were minor, I will have to put this game in Tier A, otherwise it would have gone to Tier S. Next is SENUA'S Saga HELLBLADE 2, a game which I found to be the perfect example for diminishing returns in terms of graphics to performance. Sure, while it did look great, it didn't look that great to the point where it justifies averaging less than half the frame rate that other AAA games average, and using optimized settings only gave around a 50% increase in frame rates, excluding upscalers. You would think that a game so demanding will have to include lots of scalable settings, but it doesn't, and cutscenes can have even worse performance, if you can imagine that. By the way, this game will cook your GPU, and speaking of, since it's not that scalable, it requires a higher end GPU for entry, but at least it doesn't suffer from any stuttering issues. As for the score, this might be controversial, but I will put this game in Tier D. I think it deserves it. Next is the first Descendant, a game with impressive graphics for a free-to-play game. It's very demanding, but thankfully its extensive amount of settings allowed it to be very scalable. The only negative thing I found was that the game is very CPU demanding even when nothing is going on. When things get hectic or in a lobby with other players, performance drops even further with some stutters, indicating a CPU bottleneck on most lower to mid-range CPUs, making a locked 60 FPS unachievable. Considering this is a free-to-play game, I would have thought their CPU performance targets would have been lower. For the score, I will put it in Tier C. Next is Black Myth: Wukong, a gorgeous and very demanding game, but it could have been better optimized. This game suffers from a wide performance disparity, with some areas and effects heavily tanking the frame rate. It didn't suffer from any other issues worth mentioning, and its settings were decently scalable. I found it to be a bit similar to HELLBLADE 2, in that it also has reached the point of diminishing returns in terms of graphics to performance, although not to the degree of HELLBLADE 2. I guess we have Unreal Engine 5 to thank for this, as most games released in that engine tend to be in the same situation. Much lower performance for barely better image quality. I will put this game in Tier C. Next is Star Wars Outlaws, a game with impressive natural environments. It came with a lot of settings to tweak, and they are very scalable. And even using the optimized settings, this game is still very demanding. I meticulously analyzed the game's performance and found that the CPU performance was very fair for what was going on screen, where most low and mid-range CPUs will average around 55 to 60 FPS in the worst case scenarios. But you will likely not reach those numbers because the GPU performance is going to be the limiting factor most, if not all the time. It has a very high baseline GPU for entry, and from my extensive testing over 20 hours, I don't remember encountering one single stutter, and the frame times were silky smooth. In fact, I think it's the smoothest game I have played in recent years, with perfect frame times. So this is a very well optimized yet very demanding game. For the rating, this is gonna be controversial and you might be shocked, but this game deserves to be placed in Tier A. Next is Warhammer 40,000 Space Marine 2, a game with an old-school formula consisting of multiple levels with large hordes of enemies on screen at any given time. Although the hordes were just copies of the exact same enemy type, there was no variation, which was a letdown for a current-gen game. As you would expect, the game hammers the CPU, and thankfully, it fully utilizes every drop of it. CPU performance was fair considering the large number of enemies, and overall performance was mostly good, but I did notice some jarring FPS drops here and there. The game didn't have a lot of settings to tweak, and therefore it wasn't very scalable, unless using upscaling. Otherwise, it was a decent port. I will put it in Tier B. Next is Test Drive Unlimited Solar Crown. This game has a lot of settings, which don't really help much since this game is extremely unoptimized, with very low frame rates and inconsistent frame times, leading to lots of stuttering issues and frame rate drops. Most GPUs can't even handle a stable 30 FPS, and it doesn't even look aesthetically pleasing. Its visuals are straight from a 2014 game. It clearly released way too early. It's currently in the alpha phase at best. We shouldn't reward publishers and developers with these types of games, and it rightly goes straight to Tier F. Next is Final Fantasy XVI, and boy does this game have some issues. First, it has a wide performance disparity between the different areas, and effects can heavily reduce frame rates whenever they are on screen, even if there's a lot of GPU headroom to spare. By the way, this game is absurdly GPU demanding for its visuals. It also suffers from some weird and unexplainable stuttering at times. It's more of a single large frame spike than consistent stuttering, and it happens on all hardware in both gameplay and cutscenes. It's very annoying. And speaking of cutscenes, they're locked at 30 FPS, and the game only has a few meaningful settings to tweak, making the game barely scalable. This is a very disappointing port. I will put it in Tier E where it belongs. Next is Dead Rising Deluxe Remaster, a mostly faithful remaster of an old school game, but it looks more like a remake to be honest. However, its visual quality isn't up to today's standards. At best, it looks like a PS4 era game. It offers numerous settings, and it runs at higher frame rates thanks to its lower graphical fidelity. However, not everything is positive. The game hogs VRAM for no beneficial reason, and it can crash even a 12GB card easily. It also has some stuttering issues, mostly traversal stutter after loading new areas to be exact, which is hard to ignore since it happens a lot. And crashes and freezes are a common occurrence for most, if not all, users, to the point where it has to be pointed out. And some graphical aspects of the game can look flat at times, like lighting and shading. This game definitely could have been better optimized, and it deserves to be put in Tier D. Next is God of War Ragnarok. I've put in over 70 hours testing and personally beating the game, and I can tell you that there is a major performance disparity across the game's locations. Basically, the first area of the game, Midgard, the one with the snow, runs really well at high frame rates since it was ported as is from the original God of War, and the newer areas ran mostly at around half the frame rate. Where the heck were the quality assurance and optimization teams at? Anyway, the game has a highly polished PS4 era look to its visuals, as it was designed to run on the PS4 at the end of the day. But performance can sometimes be more demanding than the game's visuals offer. The game only has a few settings to tweak, which is a letdown for a game of this magnitude, and more importantly, this game launched with a major performance bug on older generation Ryzen CPUs. which caused CPU underutilization, which led to a massive CPU performance drop. This was later fixed in patches and Ryzen CPU performance was fixed, and it ran just as expected, if not slightly better. My old R5 3600X, after the patches, could average around 70 FPS in CPU limited areas, with the 1% lows maintaining a very high baseline at the mid 50 FPS range. The game also suffered from noticeable and other minor bugs and issues at launch that later got fixed through patches. This game was clearly released just a bit too early, but thankfully it got fixed relatively quickly. At launch, I would have put this game in Tier D, but after the updates, I will have to put it in Tier B. Next is Until Dawn. This remake released on PC and had a very messy launch, with some settings not working entirely and others were broken, and the game was plagued by a lot of technical issues. Some bugs got fixed. Most noteworthy was that before, the ray tracing options were always turned on, and disabling them in the settings menu didn't do anything, and after the updates, disabling them actually worked. Therefore, general performance has improved, but it's still not to the point where it's in a good state. And at launch, when I tested it, CPU performance was noticeably bad, leaving a lot of performance on the table, causing major FPS drops and stuttering. But I suspect this issue was even more exacerbated because of the forced enabled ray tracing bug at launch, which, as you know, ray tracing has some impact on the CPU as well. But it's still not acceptable that turning ray tracing on still performs like that. CPU performance should ideally be really high, considering the very small and condensed nature of this game and its gameplay loop, which is basically walking and watching cutscenes. It's really demanding and poorly optimized at the same time. It's another game that was rushed and was obviously not ready to release. At launch, I would have put this game in Tier E, and after the updates, I'm still gonna put it in Tier E. Next is Silent Hill 2. While the game was technically advanced, artistically, it ended up looking mostly mid. It ran way worse than it should and suffered from frequent stuttering, mostly traversal stutter. This game, unfortunately, goes into Tier E. Next is Call of Duty Black Ops 6. The game looked mostly great, but had some really noticeable visual issues with LOD pop-in, screen space reflections, and some shaders and effects. And performance-wise, it's more demanding than it looks. But the very long list of available settings made it widely scalable. This game definitely deserves a higher than average rating. I'm having a hard time choosing if it should go in Tier B or Tier A, as they are both viable, but I think I will go with Tier A. Next is A Quiet Place: The Road Ahead. The game looked really good for a smaller scale indie game, but it definitely ran way worse than it should. Plus, it had frequent stuttering issues, and some settings were broken, like ray tracing, which for some odd reason further increased stuttering, and others having visual issues. This game deserves to go into Tier E. Next is Red Dead Redemption. For a port of a 14-year-old game, it sure runs like crap on modern systems. CPU performance tanks when looking at anything remotely dense on screen, dropping FPS to the 60s on low-end and mid-range CPUs, and moreover, CPU utilization is really low, so it's just free performance being left on the table. It barely utilizes the available hardware, causing GPU usage to drop for no viable reason, so it also suffers from an overall hardware underutilization. But thankfully, it doesn't suffer from any stuttering issues. It's currently been over a month and a half since the game released, and no updates or fixes have been made. Absolutely none. I'm being really generous by placing it in Tier D. Next is Dragon Age: The Veilguard. The game's performance is overall solid, with low-end CPUs rarely going below 60 FPS in certain areas, and more powerful CPUs scaling really well. The game doesn't suffer from any stuttering issues, and it performs mostly fair for how it looks. It's a well-optimized game overall, which is why I will place it in Tier A. Next is Horizon Zero Dawn Remastered, which no one asked for. It definitely ran better than the original, in the sense that it didn't suffer from stuttering or technical issues like the first one, and it was a polished port. It had really good CPU performance, but it was way more GPU demanding than the original. I mean, it's obvious for a remaster, but still. And the settings it offered barely scaled performance, so using upscalers was a necessity to improve performance. And even then, hitting 60 FPS was impossible for most mid-range GPUs. Basically, it performed almost as low as Horizon Forbidden West, but didn't look anywhere as good overall, which is why I will put it in Tier C. Next is Microsoft Flight Simulator 2024, and to everyone's surprise, it actually performed much better than the original 2020 version. It had better hardware utilization, higher frame rates, and less issues, but it wasn't perfect either, as these issues were still present, just less obtrusive. Some of these issues were random frame drops, inconsistent frame times, stuttering, and general CPU and GPU underutilization. It's obviously a very demanding simulator, and justifiably so, which is why it requires beefy hardware to run it properly. But while it was also very scalable, CPU performance was the main limiting factor if trying to aim at anything over 30 FPS for low to mid-range CPUs and over 60 FPS for high-end CPUs. If I had to rate the original 2020 version, I would have put it in Tier F, but the new 2024 version can go into Tier D. Next is Stalker 2: Heart of Chernobyl, a very disappointing launch for all of us, since it's a buggy mess with lots of technical issues, and most importantly, optimization is total garbage. Performance tanks to unplayable frame rates when entering any populated area on all CPUs, especially noticeable on low-end and mid-range CPUs. What's weird is that CPU utilization is really good, but it looks like something is eating most of the CPU performance. Most likely something to do with NPCs. Honestly, it's so bad I don't know how it launched in this state. For graphics, it definitely doesn't justify its performance. It can sometimes look good and sometimes it doesn't, and it suffered from extreme LOD pop-in that it's not even funny, and lowering settings barely increased FPS when needed most. And as of the making of this video, there are no updates which improve performance, which is why it 100% deserves to go into Tier F. Next is Delta Force, and in my entire PC gaming life, which is 10 years so far, and my 2 years specifically testing and optimizing games for a living on this channel, I have not seen a game with so many useless filler graphics options like this. This one takes the cake, as most graphics settings have 6 options to choose from, and some of these options don't do anything and are just there to fit the stupidly exaggerated graphical naming scheme, and some settings are broken and changing options doesn't do anything. Now that my mini rant is over, performance-wise, it ran really well with no stuttering issues. CPU performance especially is really impressive, allowing even low-end CPUs to achieve a very high refresh rate experience. To be specific, the R5 3600X gets bottlenecked at around 100 to 120 FPS in a large-scale battle, and overall frame rates are high. Although this game doesn't really have scalable performance because of its stupid and misleading settings, so it requires upscaling to really increase frame rates. Otherwise, it's actually one of the most optimized games I have seen. I specifically know that it uses some, if not many, clever optimization techniques to achieve such performance. I really want to put this game in tier S, but the settings issue is making me want to put it in tier A instead. This is really hard for me, but I think to be fair, and since the settings issue doesn't actually take away from the game's performance, it just adds nothing, and frame rates are already really high, I will have to put it in tier S. Next is Marvel Rivals. You would think that a free-to-play, stylized and cartoonish hero shooter would be light and achieve high frame rates, but this is not one of them. It's the exact opposite. It's somehow just as demanding as AAA single-player open-world games, if not more demanding. To be more specific, its CPU performance is flawless as expected for a hero shooter, but its GPU performance leaves a lot to be desired. Thankfully, it doesn't suffer from any stuttering issues, and the very few settings it offers offer a decent amount of scalability. But it's still not enough for a high refresh rate experience for mid-range GPUs. I know exactly where it should go, tier C. Next, and the final game on this year's list, is Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. While at a quick glance you might think it's a really well optimized game because it has relatively high frame rates for its graphics, and especially since it uses ray tracing. But the game suffers from some unforgivable technical issues, like random inconsistent frame times for no reason, terrible flickering shadows without path tracing, alongside the very short shadow cascades or pop-in, and the frequent autosave checkpoints every few feet that cause a momentary stutter. Not to forget the other minor technical issues that I won't list here, otherwise it would take too long. The game looked mostly good. The cutscenes have a really high quality cinematic AAA look to them, but during gameplay, sometimes the game would look noticeably lower quality, like it has more of a smaller scale indie game to it. No pun intended. CPU performance was slightly lower than I expected for a game of its scope, but it was fine. Oh, and I almost forgot. This game is a VRAM hog. It eats VRAM for breakfast. As a minimum, it requires an 8GB GPU that supports hardware ray tracing, so it has a very high barrier for entry. Given all of these points I just made, it shouldn't surprise anyone that this game doesn't go high on the list. I think a fair placement for it would be in tier C. And here is the final list. Take a good look at it. And of course, some of you might disagree with me on some of the placements, but remember, this is my opinion, and I believe they all deserve to be where they are. And if you want to see another list for next year's games, make sure to leave a like and tell us what you thought in the comments. And thank you for sticking around to the end.